Welcome everyone to the fourth event in the UK TEPOP 2021 online festival. I'm Maddie, an ecosystem analyst at the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and I've been working alongside the experts on integrated modelling at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the British Trust for Ornithology to bring you this workshop today as part of a project funded by the Terrestrial Surveillance, Development and Analysis Programme, which is a partnership between JNCC, BTO and UKCEH that's been running for the last 5 years and aims to develop the evidence base and help us make the most of the data we already collect. For example, by applying new analytical techniques alongside the UK TEPOP collaboration. UK TEPOP is the terrestrial evidence partnership of partnerships, which includes 18 organisations working in terrestrial monitoring that engages volunteer recorders. TEPOP encourages working together to collaborate, exchange knowledge and problem solve. If you're interested in finding out more, you can sign up to the TEPOP mailing list. Every year, TEPOP has a conference, or in recent years, a series of online webinars and workshops to collaboratively explore various topics of interest. We're halfway through this year's programme of events. If you wish to find out any more details on joining the events still to come, please do contact the TEPOP mailbox. Recordings from past events, including one that celebrated the outputs from the Terrestrial Surveillance, Development and Analysis project specifically, are or will very soon be available online via the JNCC YouTube channel. We will be recording this event too, excluding the breakout groups, so please make sure your webcams and microphones are switched off during the presentations, but do turn them back on once we move into the breakout groups later on. For the breakout groups, I'll be sending you a separate meeting invite with a link to your room, so it should be sitting in your inbox ready for when we move into the discussion sessions later on. When the breakout session ends, please return to this main meeting through the main link you were sent following registration. If you have any questions or issues with the meeting technology throughout the workshop today, please feel free to drop me a message or send me an email. And with that, I'll hand you over to Francesca Mancini from UKCEH, who will introduce the workshop itself and our speakers for today.
Thank you very much, Maddie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Integrated Modelling Workshop. So just as a bit of context, as you probably all know, we are working on a user guide on integrated modelling, and you should all have received a draft of that. That is just an initial draft that we wanted to share with you. But the aim of this workshop today is to basically present the content of that user guide as far as we go up to, and then collect some of your perspectives and some of the views about how integrated modelling can be useful for you, as well as some general feedback and any other sort of reflections that you might have during the discussion today. So today, together with me, you will hear from another few people, and they will help me facilitate the discussion sessions. I'm going to let them introduce themselves so you can see their faces and hear their voices. Michael, I imagine you're around. Could you get it started and then pass it on to someone else? Thanks.
So I'm Michael Pocock. I'm an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Particularly interested, or one of the things that I'm interested in, is the breadth of citizen science. So all the way through, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, so volunteer involvement in biodiversity recording as well. So all the way through from volunteer engagement, understanding recruitment and retention, all the way through to the use of the data. And so Francesca asked me to give a very brief introduction to the landscape of biodiversity monitoring in the UK. None of this is going to be new, I suspect, to any of you, but we thought it was helpful to start in this way in order to just make sure that we were all coming from the same sort of starting position. And I think when we're thinking about biodiversity monitoring in particular in the UK, often when we're thinking about this, we're often, or in the context of this meeting, we're thinking about this at the large scale, the monitoring at the large scale. So not simply monitoring a particular site for a particular conservation purpose. When we're thinking about this large scale, we're often focused on species monitoring, and that's what we'll tend to take as our currency. But of course, there are other things like land cover, which can come from Earth observation, from satellite data. We might also be interested in aspects to do with quality, or there might be things like site condition monitoring, as happens within SSSIs. But very often, the sorts of evidence which we use and government agencies and other environmental bodies will be using will be the data which is based on species monitoring. So we'll be looking at that. Some examples of this are shown below in the state of nature. I've got a slightly older one pictured there, but in the state of nature, a lot of it is about species monitoring, then trying to understand drivers. But we'll also see that with looking at trends in species abundance, as shown on the right there, with some of the headline biodiversity indicators, but also things like occupancy, so the amount of area which is covered by species, with things like the priority species indicator. Of course, why are we monitoring then becomes important. And often if we're getting data from, or if volunteers are offering their data, then they will have their own motivation for submitting data. But the reason that we collate it together and do something with it is often that we're focused on trends. And the very recent Nature Positive report, which was published a month or so ago, was looking at this, and implicit within that was the fact that we want those trends to change. We don't simply want to be charting the course of doom and getting gloomy. We actually want to come at this with a sense of hope and think about positive interventions that we can put in place. We are also interested in where things occur. So when you think about things like natural capital accounting, biodiversity net gain, questions like that, those will often be about the where. And then how are we monitoring? Well, I hinted at that a moment ago. We often have this major reliance on volunteer recorders. So that might be what we choose to lump under a big banner of citizen science, but of course that includes expert naturalists and a whole load of things as well. And that is increasing. The number of people who are submitting records is increasing, partly due to the fact that submitting records has become easier and easier as time has gone on, with smartphones and apps and all sorts of things like this. And what I wanted to do now is just briefly go through, sorry these are quite so wordy, but briefly go through a couple of examples of the different types of data that we deal with. So the first one is structured data. And that might be seen as a sort of, in some respects, a gold standard. It's the closest to the sorts of data which professionals would go out and collect, but they happen to be collected by volunteers. There's a standardized protocol, usually there's repeat visits, and it's often based on species counts. So the Breeding Bird Survey or the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme are great examples of these sorts of things. They tend to be based on a sampling design, and the whole thing with having a sampling protocol is that it allows the detection to be taken into account. It also means that these observations are comparable. So we know that if somebody went out 20 years ago in Scotland and did a breeding bird survey transect, that would be comparable data with me going out in Oxfordshire and doing it next year. Within these, site selection tends to be prescribed, so it tends to be selected by the people who are developing the scheme, and that will often be randomised as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be completely randomised. It might be that that there's different inclusion probabilities, and a clear example of that is the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, where actually the selection of sites depends upon features of interest within those sites, but it's done in a statistical way, so we can take account of that in the final analysis. The challenge with all of this structured data is that it does put a bit of demand on volunteers. That can actually be very motivating to volunteers, but it clearly does cap the likely number of people who are potentially involved. And so the issue with that is that it means that these sort of structured recording schemes tend to be used, or are used, for the species which are very popular anyway. So with birds and with butterflies, you've got so many people out there recording them anyway, that even if only a small percentage of those recorders do some standardized or structured recording, we can still get loads and loads of data, which is great. It does require that effort to keep maintaining it, to recruit new volunteers when volunteers drop out, and all of this. And yeah, so it's a substantial input required, financial input for each of these schemes. And it does mean that the number of sites is limited. So in the best cases, it's a couple of thousand, but if we were looking at other taxa, then that number would drop off. The classic sort of citizen science data that you would get from biodiversity recording is unstructured data. It has a whole load of different terms which can also be used, opportunistic or ad hoc. It's really quite tricky coming up with the right term, because often an individual or a group might have a really clear structure. It's not opportunistic at all. They're doing this in order to fill gaps in the distribution map, or they're all doing it in order to sample according to some particular regime. It might be revisits or something like this. The point is that by the time they get those records get verified and they get aggregated together, we typically lose any of the metadata that would have been associated with individual data points. And so it becomes this sort of real mixed bag. And all the challenges of dealing with that in terms of the verification of identifications and checking that the data quality is good. But also checking, being able to take account of the fact that we don't know exactly the way in which it was collected. Was it somebody who was brand new to this, who went out, saw a couple of brightly coloured things and reported them? Or was it somebody who was a real expert who looked thoroughly and deeply with a decade's worth of knowledge and found a couple of things and reported them? So all of this is challenging, and there are statistical ways of dealing with this. These tend to lead to really large data sets in the region of millions of records per year, and they do have coverage in space and time. So many more sites are visited than the couple of thousand than would be the case with structured data. This means that there can be much greater taxonomic coverage for even those taxa which are seem more obscure to many of us, fungus gnats and various different things like this. We can actually gather a whole load of data on them. Of course, it may still require skill to identify the species, and we're still left with this spatial unevenness in coverage. And as I said, there are methods such as occupancy modelling. Frascalo is another particular statistical technique which you may have come across, which can be used for these sorts of data. And then we get to this thing that sounds like it's midway between the two, but I think is actually something somewhat different. So semi-structured sampling is a wide range of different sampling techniques. And the whole point about semi-structured sampling is that you still typically have the flexibility where somebody can take part whenever, wherever they want, as with unstructured sampling. But there's some aspect of the sampling process which is recorded alongside it. And it might be recorded alongside it because there's a strict protocol. Something as simple as the big butterfly count asks people to go out in their gardens and count for, I think that's 15 minutes. So it has a degree of sampling design associated with it. And similarly with the pollinator fit counts, look at a patch of flowers, 50 centimetres squared, and count for 10 minutes. So those sorts of things do have some structure associated with them. That might be implicit. So eDNA sampling has it. So you take a sample of a certain sample of water, and that then gets analysed. And again, that has that degree of sampling within it. Information about the sampling process captured within it. We can also do this via data capture, and that might be via using apps. So eBird certainly does this for birding. It can even track how far you've walked and how long you've been birding for while you submit your data. And so that can be a measure of effort. You're expecting to see more birds if you're out for longer and you've walked further, for instance. And we can also make this implicit, so you can be able to indicate in things like bird track whether you're submitting a complete list of all the species that you've seen or not, and that then is really valuable information. All of this is great, and as you can see, there are a wide range of different ways of getting semi-structured data, great flexibility for participants, and it does mean that those observations become a bit more comparable in space and time, but there are loads of different ways of doing it. So you've got all this breadth of volunteers and professionals, experts and novices, good coverage in space and time through to uneven, leading to all these different ways in which we can collect data, which all get put together as data on UK biodiversity, but actually need to be handled quite differently. And as we go on in the meeting, we're going to talk about some of the opportunities for dealing with this.
Thank you very much, Michael. Fantastic way to start the day. So today there's about 40 attendees, and that means that unfortunately we can't go around the room for all of you to introduce yourselves. So we thought we'd ask you a couple of questions just for us to understand our audience, really. If you could go to this slido.com, we'll use it a couple of times today. And you can use any device. You can use your phone if you want, or your computer. Slido.com, and then enter the code 943709. There will be a couple of questions for you to answer. And the first one is, which of these best describes your organization? So this is the results will come in live, so I can see how many people have replied, have answered. So yeah, just pick one, or maybe you can pick multiple. I can't remember whether I said it to multiple or not. Just to, yeah, again, have an idea of who's talking to us today. Looks like it's a good variety, which is great. If anyone is having any technical issues accessing this, just let us know. That's great. I think I'm going to go on to the next question now, which is just about which of these best describes your role in your organization. And I think you should be able to tick multiple ones here. It's really great to see the results changing live. That is really interesting. Not what I expected at all, actually. Great. I'm going to move on, and thank you very much for answering those questions. There's actually a few more for you now. So we thought we would, because we've given you this introduction to sort of biodiversity data in the UK, and so we thought that it would be great if we could, if all of the information that comes after in this workshop would be set in the context of your own data, the data that you use day to day. So if you can open another window and access Slido again, slido.com, but this time enter the code 504935. There's going to be another 3 questions about the data that you use. So we have a few different keywords here, and Michael said earlier, the definitions may overlap and one may contain the other, but we thought everybody has slightly different definitions of things, of data. So that's because it's only one person. Yeah, so you can tick all the responses that apply to you. That's great. So this kind of reflects the sort of also the availability of data out there, but it's great to see so much variety of data sets used. So the next one is about what do you use the data for? So what do you usually produce with these data sets? And again, there's lots of different options and you can tick all the ones that are relevant. Again, great variety of uses. So the last one is a little different. It should produce a word cloud at the end, and you'll have one box where you can enter your answer. You can submit multiple answer, and the idea is that you would submit 2. So the question is there any type of data that is available to you but not used or not often used? And in that first box, if you could write 1 or 2 words to describe this data type, and then in a second box, if you could write 1 or 2 words to describe why the data is underused. And you can submit as many answers as you want, to just keep them brief so that the word cloud at the end can make sense. This is really interesting. So I can see already the citizen science and unstructured are the most chosen words, most used words. And in terms of sort of reason, there's a lot to do with interpretation and bias and trust. which is really interesting. I can see also computational power methods. Yeah, that's really good. And this is sort of going to set the scene quite nicely for what we're going to talk about next. This word cloud is looking beautiful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to leave this running so you can keep entering your answers if you like. And I am going to go on to actually introducing integrated distribution models. So if we start from the beginning, let's say that we have a species distribution that we would like to know something about. Usually we cannot observe this true species distribution, especially over large areas, but what we can do is we can sample from this distribution. And we can sample in lots of different ways and create different data sets. For example, a presence-only data set or a presence-absence, or even a count data set. Now, very rarely we can use these raw data to infer the true species distribution, because we know that the observation process is imperfect. Even if a species is present at the time of sampling at that site, there's always a chance that we're going to miss it. So the probability of detecting a species that is present at the site and time of sampling is usually less than 1. There are also different factors that can influence the probability of observing a species. For example, the species behavior or size. So a large species or a very colorful species or very vocal one will be more easy to observe than a species that doesn't have those characteristics. There are also ecological processes that can influence the probability of observing a species, such as season, for example. A bumblebee is more likely to be seen in the summer than in the winter. And then there's all sorts of observer behaviors that can influence the probability of detection, including where an observer decides to go or how long they spend searching. So usually we need a model to understand the true species distribution, and that's what species distribution models do. They take into account all of these factors, as well as some environmental variables that might be important in explaining the true species distribution, to produce an inferred species distribution that hopefully looks something similar to the true species distribution. But what do we do when we have multiple data sets? The simplest thing that we can do is to just model each data set separately. And then we'll basically end up, in this case, with 3 different inferred species distribution that hopefully are the same, but sometimes they're not. And then we are left with the tricky task of trying to reconcile these differences or trying to explain them. The other thing that we can do is to just pick one data set, maybe the one with the most information content, the abundance one, and just go with that one. But that means discarding a lot of the information that is available on the species in question, which is not ideal. The other way that we can do it is to try and combine these data sets together. The first way that we can do that is with data merging. So we just take all the data sets and merge them into one and then just model them as they were one single data set. Obviously, we cannot go from a presence-only data set to a count data set. So what we need to do is degrade the count data set to a presence-only data set, which means, again, discarding quite a lot of information. Also, it means that we cannot describe the differences in which these data sets were collected. We cannot take that into account. And we need to, for example, assume that a structured data set has the same biases as an unstructured data set that we are merging it into. The better way to do it is model-based data integration. In this case, we keep the 3 separate data sets separate, and we explicitly describe them with 3 separate observation models. An observation model is a statistical description of the observation process that generated the data. And so it can include all sorts of terms to account for biases, for example. And all these 3 observation models will then be linked together to a single state model, or the ecological model that is a statistical description of the ecological processes that we believe to govern the true species distribution. And this way, we obtain one unified inferred species distribution from all of the information that is available. So how does it work? Let's say that we have 2 separate data sets, a structured presence-absence data set that was collected using a standardized repeated protocol, so effort is standardized across the visits, and also using a randomized sampling design, so we don't have problems with spatial bias, for example. On the other hand, we have an unstructured presence-only data set that is very large. However, the effort that went into collecting this data is not known, and we assumed it to be uneven across visits. And also we have some spatial and temporal biases because the data was collected opportunistically. So how do we deal with all these issues in the unstructured data? Michael mentioned earlier occupancy detection models, and this is what they look like in a simplified format. So we have an occupancy detection model is a hierarchical model because it has different components that are linked. So in this case, this bit in the orange, this component of the model in orange is the state submodel that models the true presence, absence, or abundance of the species as a function, in this case, for example, of different environmental covariates. On the other hand, we have the observation submodel in blue, which models the process, describes the process that created the data. So we model a probability of detecting the species as a function of different variables. In this case, we can, for example, include a variable that expresses the seasonality in the detectability of the species, the example of the bumblebee that I said earlier. And also we can add some terms that explain some of the biases that might be present in the data, like a spatial term to explain the spatial bias, and also a variable that might be a proxy for effort, for survey effort. So this is a great framework for an integrated model because of its hierarchical nature. It means that we can have different components. So in the case of an integrated model, all we need to do is add a second observation submodel that will describe the structured data. So the state submodel stays exactly the same. The observation submodel that describes the unstructured data is the same as in the previous slide. And then we have this new observation submodel that describes the structured data set. Again, it models the probability of detection. In this case, only as a function of seasonality, because we don't have the process that created the data was following a randomized sampling design and also a standardized protocol. So we don't have problems of spatial bias or uneven effort. And the seasonality, the parameters that describe the seasonality and detectability can be shared between the two separate observation models because the process that is influencing detectability is assumed to be the same. So this is how an integrated distribution model works, and there are different advantages of using this framework. First of all, it increases the quantity of data that is available to us because we are using multiple data sets. But at the same time, it can borrow strengths from multiple data sources. For example, the large scale or the really high sampling intensity that we find in unstructured data, and also the reliability of the structured data. And this can lead to reduced uncertainty and more precise estimates of species distributions, as well as better inference on hidden parameters, those that it might not have been possible to estimate using only one single data set. We can also increase the extent of the inference. For example, we can integrate historical museum records to more recent biological records to extend time series in the past. And we can also translate between ecological occurrences because we can use a presence-only data set together with an abundance data set to make inferences about population abundance. So this is an introduction to sort of integrated distribution models. So now we're going to present a couple of case studies so you can see integrated distribution models in action. So the first one will be on birds.
Hello, I'm Philip Berstupan. I'm a senior ecological statistician at the British Trust for Ornithology, and I'm mostly interested in trying to make sense of all the data that we collect to figure out what bird populations are doing. And so I want to quite quickly talk today about how we use integrated models with multiple data sources to estimate regional bird trends. And so very quickly, I want to recap how we monitor birds in the UK in the first place. Mike covered most of that ground in abstract terms, but essentially for UK breeding birds, the Breeding Bird Survey, which is a structured survey, forms the backbone of bird monitoring. It has incredibly high coverage. We manage to get volunteers out to cover about 1.5% of the terrestrial land surface of the UK every year, covering over 4,000 plots. and that enables us to publish trends every year for about 120 species at the UK level, and between about 40 and about 100 within each constituent country. So in the smaller countries, like Northern Ireland, we get fewer species because we have less coverage. And then these data feed into all sorts of statutory reporting, such as the state of birds and state of nature and indicators. How about now?
That works, yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
excellent. So, so we have this great survey, essentially, the Breeding Bird Survey, that delivers world-class bird trends, kind of with a coverage that is unachieved in most other nations. But at the same time, like conservation policy and how we manage the countryside is increasingly devolved in space. And so there are many different spatial units of interest, and that starts with jurisdictions, but also spatial units, things like the national parks, landscape units. So National England have designated these over 100 national character areas. In Wales, NRW have designated statement areas. And so we're increasingly being asked to come up with trend models for smaller and smaller regions. And that is something that the BBS is simply not designed to deliver inferences about. So if you take these Welsh statement areas, and I have this little plot in the bottom of the slide, if we apply the reporting standards we have for BBS to those areas, then there are some areas, for example, in South Central Wales and Eastern Northeast Wales, where not a single species fulfills the reporting thresholds. And so we simply cannot report at the spatial scales that we're being asked to report at, because the survey is designed to give us a big picture. And to overcome this, we're trying now to rely on additional data sources. And for us, that's the BirdTrack scheme, which is a scheme for recording any bird observations. Really, data entry can be done by members of the public via an app or a web portal. And unlike for the breeding bird survey, there's no fixed observation protocol. So people select the sites themselves. It's optional whether or not they list all the species they encounter. But today, I will only consider those data entries where people have indicated they're submitting complete lists. Counting is optional, effort recording is optional. So it's much easier, there's a lower threshold to participate. And that means BirdTrack delivers a lot of data. We get about 7 million species records every year at the moment from about 15,000 locations. So that's about 4 times as many locations as BBS covers. And then if we look at how that coverage is distributed, it's quite evenly across the UK. So BirdTrack here is in the center and on the right. But we also see that because we use volunteers for both schemes, that the biases in coverage are similar. And so we have especially gaps in the upland regions and in Northern Ireland, where there's fewer people, essentially. And really importantly for trends, and this is kind of one of the reasons why do we run a workshop today on these complicated models, because the data are complicated. And so the biases are not only in space, the biases are also in time. And so here I've plotted essentially the density of records in both schemes against the human population density in each 10 by 10 kilometer square in the UK. And we can see, because the breeding bird survey is designed, that bias there's a very slight bias, more volunteers, more surveys, but that bias has not changed over time. In BirdTrack, every year we reach more people to participate, and we predominantly reach them in populated areas. So in the lighter colors, you can see that every year the BirdTrack data set is a bit more biased towards the urban regions in the UK. And so whenever we derive trends, we cannot simply take those data face value. We need to account for this change in bias. And that is something we have done in this case study here, where we were interested in inferring trends for corn bunting in the South Downs, to an area of about 1,000 square kilometers. in the south of England, and we combined structured data from BBS, shown here on the bottom, with kind of a few sites, but dark colors indicating we have long time series at each of those sites. And we combined that with about 10-fold the number of locations from bird track using presence-absence data from complete lists. But many of those indicated by the light colors had much shorter time series. And the idea was, going back to this kind of observation and state model that Francesca introduced, is we have a state model that models the abundance trend of corn bunting in these locations. And then we have a separate observation model for the BBS and the bird track data. And so they take into account that, for example, effort is variable in bird track and the sites aren't randomly chosen. And the technical details, I won't go into those. We have a preprint that's here on the slides where you can read up on all the technical details. But essentially what we found is we could account for all the heterogeneous observation effort in the bird track data and leverage the increased sample size that gave us and arrive with both occupancy and abundance trends. And they're shown here in red for this integrated model and compared to single data source trends in black. And you can see that the precision of these integrated trends is much, much higher than when we only use one data source alone. So that's a great success, I would say. We can actually take a species of conservation interest in a very small area and get robust trends for them. But unfortunately, that doesn't work everywhere. And I think that is one important thing to keep in mind, is that if you ask for specific deliverables in trend reporting, such as smaller areas, that may mean you also need to up your monitoring. And for example, we applied this same model, same approach to the last stronghold of corn buntings in Scotland, which is in northern Aberdeenshire. And the problem there is we're not right next to Brighton. So this is a low population density area for humans. So there is lower BBS coverage. There's much lower bird track coverage. So the colors here indicate the bird track list densities. And when we ran that same model on a similarly sized area, we didn't get the same improvement in the trend uncertainty. So all the trends that are underneath the dashed line here are more precise than trends from a single data source. And that's fulfilled in the green boxes, which are in England, but that's not fulfilled in the Scottish boxes. So data integration is very powerful, but it's not a silver bullet if there aren't any data to be integrated. And that's perhaps trivial, but I think that's something to keep in mind. So in summary, we can show that integrated modeling provides great opportunities in improving our ability to give trends for birds in small areas, so in this kind of 1,000 to 10,000 square kilometer range. It's still kind of not a one-size-fit-all approach that can be rolled out across species. The models need to be customized. And that means that the questions you might have will probably require both some thinking about how to integrate data sources, but they may also require additional monitoring. So that's always something to keep in mind. And especially when you think about then how you implement additional monitoring or how you try to steer these unstructured schemes, it is really, really helpful to encourage the recording of effort. It's really helpful to encourage volunteers to record complete lists. And depending where you want to do inferences, you may have to steer where your volunteers go. And that's something we see, that high intensity agricultural landscapes, we get very few list submissions because people don't expect to see as many species. And yeah, with that, I'll take it back to Francesca.
Thank you very much, Philip. So I'm going to now present the second case study. So this one is about bumblebees, and so it's an example of using a model-based data integration framework to combine the structured and unstructured bumblebee data from citizen science schemes. So the data that we had available was a large unstructured data set from the bees, wasps, and ants recording society. As you can see from the map on the left, this is quite a large data set with tens of thousands of records and quite good spatial coverage around the nation, especially in England. But as typical of these unstructured data sets, the sampling effort is unknown and we assume it to be uneven and across visits. And also there is some spatial and temporal bias with number of records increasing through time as more volunteers join the scheme. And also you can see England is much better covered than north of England or Scotland. On the other hand, we had a semi-structured data set from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust Bee Walks. This is a semi-structured data set because the volunteers are asked to walk a fixed transect at least 4 times a year and record all the bumblebee species that they observe. So there is a standardized repeated protocol. However, it is still subject to some of the same biases as the Bee Walks data because the volunteers can choose the location of their transects. And also the scheme has become more popular over the years, so we also have recording intensity increasing over time. In terms of size, well, the Bee Walks data set is about 5 times larger than the Bee Walks one, and these are numbers from 2010 to 2017, which was the period of overlap between the two data sets. So what we did was we fitted 4 different models to this data, 2 single data set models, one for the Bee Walks data and one for the Bee Walks data, and 2 with the data sets combined, one with data merging, so we just merged the data sets into one, and then an integrated model. So this is what the models look like. So this is the Bee Walks only model, and it's very similar. It's an occupancy detection model, very similar to the simplified version that I showed you before. We have this state submodel in orange that models the true presence absence of a species according to a probability of occupancy, which is the probability that a site is occupied by the species. And this is modeled as a function of a year effect to account for interannual variability in occupancy, and also a site effect, which accounts for uneven recording intensity in space through time. In blue, we have the observation submodel that describes the way that the Bee Walks data was collected to the best of our knowledge. It models the probability of detection as a function of different variables. In this case, we have a seasonality, so Julian date variable, that expresses that seasonality in the detectability of bumblebees, and also a proxy variable for effort. In this case, this is the list length, which is basically the number of species that were recorded during a visit. And the assumption here is that the longer lists basically were the product of longer surveys. The model that describes the Bee Walks only model has exactly the same state submodel and an observation model that models the probability of detecting a bumblebee species only as a function of seasonality, because we don't have to account for an even sampling effort here. And the merged model is exactly the same as the Bee Walks only model, the same state submodel and the same observation model. And this is because we had to degrade the semi-structured data set to the same level as the unstructured data set because we were merging them together. The integrated model has the same exact state submodel as all the previous ones that I showed you. The observation submodel for the Bee Walks data is the same as the one that I showed you before. And then we have the additional observation submodel for the Bee Walks data. And again, the probability of detection is only modeled as a function of seasonality, and the parameters that describe the seasonality for both data sets are shared between the 2 observation submodels. So the first thing we did was to look at how the estimates of occupancy compare across all these models. And this is what these plots show, the estimates of occupancy from the integrated model on the y-axis and from all the other model variants on the x-axis. So occupancy is the proportion of sites that are occupied by a species in any given year. And these graphs, they're a bit busy, but basically those vertical and horizontal lines that come from the points are the uncertainty around those estimates from the model. So the vertical line are the uncertainty from the integrated model, and the horizontal line are the uncertainty from the other model variant. The dashed line is the one-to-one line, and so basically if all the points are on top of that line, it means that there is no difference in the estimates of occupancy from the integrated model or the other model variants. So the first thing that these plots tell us is that the estimates of occupancy are generally similar across all the models, with the biggest departure being the comparison with the B-Walks only model. And this has very much to do with sample size. The B-Walks data was only a small part of the data that contributed to the integrated model, so it makes sense that the biggest differences will be here. The other thing that these plots tell us is that there is no obvious difference in the uncertainty with which that parameter is estimated by the integrated model compared to the other ones. But we can see that a little bit better in the next slide, which shows you the precision of one of the state model parameters, where precision is 1 divided by the standard deviation of the parameter estimate. So it's basically a measure of uncertainty. The higher the precision, the lower the uncertainty with which that parameter is estimated by the model. So the points are these metrics of precision from the integrated model on the y-axis and the other model variants on the x-axis. The parameter in question is parameter A, which is the year effect on the probability of occupancy that was in those diagrams that I showed you before. The black line with the shaded areas, just the regression line that shows you the correlation between the precision of this parameter from the integrated model and the other model variants. And the dashed line is again the one-to-one line. So if all the points sit above that line, it means that the integrated model is more precise than the other model variant. So generally, precision of state model parameter is higher in the integrated model compared to the single dataset models, although the biggest difference is again in the comparison with the B-Walks only model. The other thing that you can notice from these plots is that there is no difference in the precision of the state model parameter between the integrated and the merged model. They're just as precise as each other. So what's going on here? So the integrated model did marginally outperform the single dataset variants, but this result can very much be attributed to the increase in the number of records that we have available for the integrated model, especially when you consider that the estimates from the merged model were just as precise as the ones from the integrated variant. So why might this be happening? Well, the B-Walks dataset is very, very large, 5 times larger than the B-Walks dataset. So it might mean that this is overwhelming all the information present in the B-Walks data. Also, the B-Walks data does contain some of the same biases as the B-Walks data, particularly the temporal and spatial bias. So this might be why the merged model is just doing a good enough job. But it also begs another question: is precision of state parameters really a good metric to evaluate model performance? Precision is useful because a precise estimate can allow us to detect a trend when there is one. However, we could also be very precisely wrong. Also, these results sort of provide a baseline assessment of the value of data integration, not really a final answer. And really, they just spark another question, which is how much structured data is enough? And to add value to the unstructured data sets. And to answer this question, we're basically creating different subsets of the structured data, the B-Walks data, of different sizes. And then we'll fit the integrated model again and try and compare them to see whether there is a point, a certain size, a certain minimum size of structured data set below which there's just no point integrating it, basically. And answering this question is going to be very important to inform future monitoring. We know, as Michael said, structured sampling requires a lot more resources than opportunistic sampling. It's a lot more demanding for volunteers. And this is why it's usually quite tricky to implement and also keep going these sort of structured monitoring effort in citizen science schemes. And answering this question is going to give us the opportunity to plan and implement future monitoring more effectively, more efficiently, because we know what the absolute minimum number of sites is that we need to monitor in order to add value to the data that we already have. It also can allow us to design more flexible monitoring schemes for volunteers, because all of their contributions will be valued and used in analysis, no matter whether they can or cannot commit to structured monitoring. because we won't have to either discard unstructured data because we don't trust it, or degrade structured data set to the lowest common denominator. So this is an opportunity for the future. Right, so with that, we are done presenting the case studies. And at this point, we're going to give you the opportunity to ask some questions.
Hi, sorry, I'm not very familiar with Teams, so I'm struggling a bit to work out how to raise hands and do things like that. I was wondering, and maybe we'll come to this later in the discussions, but I was wondering, to what extent should we be thinking about that gradient from structured to unstructured and moving along that in order to increase participation while maintaining some of the advantages of structured data? So there might be sweet spots. And I know within my own organization, which is BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, there are that moving from one to the other, we've got certain surveys which sit at very well-defined points along those gradients. But actually moving any of those surveys along to make them more or less structured can be very hard, because people get quite can get quite defensive about many of the aspects of the survey which they perceive to be responsible for the quality of the survey. But actually, I wonder if there's a way of encouraging people to be more flexible and to find out more about those trade-offs, because they are undoubtedly trade-offs. They're kind of costs and benefits, but actually thinking about them in the round as what the real overall costs or benefits are can be really difficult, I think.
Francesca, did you want to come in with a response to that?
That is a really good question. And yeah, on the engagement side, that's really not my my expertise. But on the technical side, yeah, the sort of investigation that we're doing now to figure out how much structured data or is enough, and that is in relation to unstructured data, could help answer that question of how much can how much is it worth it to sort of change the way that we monitor right now to collect more structured data or more unstructured data. But yeah, on the engagement side, I'm afraid I'm a bit of a loss.
It's almost it's a really similar question to the one that you posed in your talk and the one that you've outlined there, but it's slightly different. It's not so much what the balance of unstructured and structured data is when you're considering them as two data sets, but what's the right balance to strike in any one data set in terms of how unstructured or structured to make it. I'm not really expecting anybody to have an answer to this, because it's quite a complicated question, I think, and it's going to be so situation specific in lots of different parameters. But you've made yourself available on your camera, Philip, just for the joy of looking at you. But if you've got some response to that, that would be good.
I think technology can be our friend here, and I think we should strive to. So I think from a purely statistical perspective, the single best thing we can do is to try to gather as much effort metadata as we can, because that then it limits the unknowns we have for the unstructured data, and we can actually try to put different observations onto the same footing. And I think rather than implementing that as giving volunteers more and more protocol points that they have to stick to, is I think there is a big opportunity for technology to do that for us, like Mike was saying in the beginning. If we have apps, for example, that can support people while they are in the field, and that can't just automatically record a lot of the different things, then I think we can reach more people and yet get the same data, or the kind of most of the data most out of the data that they can record. But I mean, as a statistician, yes, I always want more metadata. And so I think the trick is how do we collect that metadata without overwhelming volunteers.
And I guess as well, thanks for that, Philip. I guess as well, the more data we have for the more observations, the more we can see which parameters are the most important to keep controlled and to make standardized, and which parameters, if any, we can be more comfortable about relaxing. It might not surprise you, Philip, to know that I'm thinking specifically of upland rovers in the context of the breeding bird survey. And so there's kind of a variant of the breeding bird survey which we've rolled out in the past few years to try and get more coverage in the uplands. And we have relaxed some of the requirements of the breeding bird survey for the same observers to go back to the same squares every year. And that has, as we thought it would, resulted in greater participation in those areas. But there's still a question hanging over that about what kind of a cost we're paying by allowing there to be a greater mix of people collecting information from these squares. And that is something that, if we have enough data, we should be able to get a handle on.
Thanks, Mark. That's brilliant. We'll go on to the next question now, which was one from the chat. So what are some of the major limitations of model-based data integration? Francesca, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, they are challenging technically. They're quite computationally expensive. It takes quite a lot of power and time to fit them. Also, they're quite tricky to get them to converge because there is a lot of parameters that need to be estimated. And then there is the issue of are we sampling the same thing in both data sets? That is something that we need to sort of be able to assume that we're sampling the same population, for example, the same species distribution. And there are a lot of outstanding questions. It's a very new sort of technique. So there are still a lot of questions that we have that we don't have answers to. For example, if we're integrating a small data set, a structured data set from a little region to a national scale large data set, how is that small sort of scale data set, what is it telling us about other regions in the UK, for example? And the same with the time, so historical records versus recent records. So yeah, there's a lot of unanswered questions, but a lot of potential.
Anything to add, Philip, or should we go to the next question? Oh, I think you might have frozen. We'll go to the next question. Should integrated models be used when structured and unstructured data are showing different trends? For example, for some moth species, unstructured data are showing increases in distribution and structured data are showing declines in abundance. Should we go to Francesca again? I think Philip might still be frozen. Oh no, he's back. Philip, did you want to have a go at this one?
It's a hard one. I mean, the problem is we don't know the truth about many species, or most, maybe all species trends. So I think whenever I think there's disagreement, one needs to really carefully revisit what is being sampled. And there are some kind of easy mistakes to make with unstructured data when you take them face value. And kind of the most, or one very common effect is that as unstructured schemes grow, the breadth of the volunteers in their skills and also in where they sample changes, and then simply aggregating over records can tell you more about actually the observers than it actually tells you about the species you're sampling. And so I think whenever you have disagreement in these data, it's really, really important to first break down the sampling structure and then see if that still holds. If in doubt, you would hope that your structured data are unbiased. They may be very uncertain, but they should be unbiased, whereas that's something you can almost never assume for unstructured data.
Perfect, thanks. So we've got 2 more questions in the chat. We're out of the time that we'd allocate, 3 more that allocated for this. So I'm wondering if maybe people could pop answers into the chat during the break, if you're happy with that. And we're now having a 5-minute break, after which we will still be in this main meeting room. So you should have received your breakout invitations, which we'll go to afterwards. But first of all, Francesca will be explaining concept board back in this main link. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes, so at 15:15. Thank you.